The cantina fell silent as Zektar's 4 arms trembled around his drinking vessel. The old Thrakari veteran's chitinous exoskeleton bore scars from a dozen campaigns. But tonight, his normally steady voice carried an edge that made even hardened mercenaries lean forward. "You want to know about humans?" Zektar's mandibles clicked nervously. "Sit down then, all of you, because what I'm about to tell you will change how you see those pink-skinned bipeds forever." A young Zalarian pilot named Crix settled into a nearby chair. "Come on, old-timer. Humans aren't that scary. They're just another species that got lucky with their technology." Zektar's compound eyes fixed on the youth with an intensity that made him shrink back. "Lucky? Child, I fought alongside humans during the Corvin Uprising. What I witnessed there, it still haunts my dreams 50 cycles later." The veteran took a long drink, his throat sacs pulsing as he swallowed. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of terrible memory. It was supposed to be a simple peacekeeping mission. The Corvin had enslaved 3 systems, and the Galactic Council finally decided to intervene. My unit, the 47th Shock Division, was assigned to support the human 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force. We thought we were doing them a favor. Zektar paused, his eyes distant. The humans arrived in ships that looked crude compared to our sleek vessels. Blocky gray things covered in weapon pods and armor plating. When their commander, a female named Colonel Sarah Chen, briefed us on the mission, I remember thinking how small and fragile she looked. A Vorthon trader interrupted. "So what happened? Did they break under pressure?" "Break?" Zektar's laugh was bitter. "The first engagement was on Corvin Prime's 2nd moon. Intelligence said it was lightly defended. Maybe 200 enemy soldiers in a mining facility. Standard procedure called for orbital bombardment followed by a careful advance." The alien veteran stood up, his movements agitated. Colonel Chen looked at the tactical display for exactly 30 seconds. Then she turned to her subordinates and said 3 words that still make my carapace itch. "Fast and violent." "What does that mean?" Crix asked. "It means," Zektar continued, beginning to pace, "that while we were still calculating firing solutions and approach vectors, 200 humans dropped from orbit in individual pods. No coordination, no backup. Just 200 Marines falling like meteors into what should have been a carefully planned assault. The cantina patrons exchanged glances. This wasn't matching their preconceptions of human military doctrine. The humans call it a hot drop. They burned through the atmosphere in those metal coffins, using nothing but retro thrusters to slow down at the last possible second. Half of them landed in the middle of the enemy compound. The other half scattered across the moon's surface, sometimes kilometers apart. Zektar's voice grew quieter, more intense. Any rational species would have been slaughtered, dispersed, outnumbered, with no support. It should have been a massacre. But humans aren't rational. He stopped pacing and faced his audience directly. Instead of trying to regroup or establish a perimeter, each Marine began hunting. Not defending, not organizing, hunting. They moved through that facility like predators stalking prey, using the confusion of their landing to their advantage. A Keltorian engineer shifted uncomfortably. But surely the Corvin fought back. Oh, they tried. Zektar's mandibles spread in what might have been a smile on any other species. The Corvin are formidable warriors. 2 meters tall, natural armor plating, incredible strength. They outnumbered the humans and knew the terrain. By every tactical calculation, they should have won. The veteran returned to his seat, his movements now slow and deliberate. I monitored the human communications during the assault. Do you know what they talked about? Not tactical positions or ammunition counts. One Marine, call sign Banshee, was describing his grandmother's cookie recipe to his squad while methodically hunting down enemy soldiers. Another was humming something called classical music as he set explosive charges. "That's insane," whispered a Rigelian trader. "Insane?" Zektar's eyes glowed brighter. That was just the beginning. 20 minutes into the assault, a group of Corvin managed to corner 3 Marines in a storage bay. The humans were outnumbered 5-1, low on ammunition, and had no way out. He leaned forward conspiratorially. Instead of surrendering or fighting defensively, the ranking human, a sergeant named Jackson, ordered his men to fix bayonets. Do you know what that means? The crowd shook their heads. It means they attach knives to their projectile weapons and charge the Corvin in hand-to-hand combat. Knives, against creatures that could tear them apart with their bare claws. Zektar's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I watched the security footage later. Those 3 humans moved like a single organism, covering each other's flanks, striking and retreating in perfect coordination. They didn't just survive that encounter, they won it. In 30 seconds, 5 Corvin warriors were dead, and the humans were already moving to their next objective. A Manthari captain from across the room spoke up. Surely that was exceptional. Elite forces, perhaps. That's what I thought too, Zektar replied. So I accessed their personnel files. Sergeant Jackson was a construction worker before he enlisted. Banshee had been a school teacher. The 3rd Marine, Rodriguez, was 19 years old and had been in the military for exactly 6 months. The silence that followed was deafening. But it gets worse, Zektar continued. The facility had multiple levels connected by narrow corridors, perfect for defense. The Corvin fell back to these choke points, thinking they could bottle up the human advance. What they didn't understand was that humans don't think like we do. He gestured with one of his hands. While 50 Marines kept the Corvin busy at the main entrances, the others were cutting through walls, floors, and ceilings. They moved through that structure like water flowing around rocks, appearing behind enemy positions, striking from unexpected angles. The humans have a term for this kind of warfare: mouse-holing. They literally carved their own passages through solid metal and rock, using portable cutting tools and explosives. By the time the Corvin realized what was happening, humans were attacking them from 6 different directions simultaneously. A young Altarian merchant raised a tentacled appendage. What about the Corvin leadership? Surely they adapted to human tactics. Zektar's laugh was harsh. The Corvin commander, a veteran named Crux who had won 17 major battles, tried to coordinate a defense from the facility's command center. It was 3 levels underground, accessible only through a heavily fortified elevator shaft, impregnable by any reasonable standard. He paused for effect. 22 minutes after the first human landed, Crux's head appeared on a pike outside the main entrance. The humans had somehow infiltrated his command bunker without triggering a single alarm. How? Several voices asked simultaneously. The ventilation system, Zektar replied matter-of-factly. While we were all focused on the obvious routes of attack, a human demolitions expert named Wang had crawled through air ducts barely wide enough for his body. He spent 15 minutes worming through metal passages that would have given most species claustrophobia-induced panic attacks. The veteran's expression grew distant. Wang placed a single-shaped charge directly above the command center and waited. When the explosion created a hole in the ceiling, he dropped down into a room full of armed Corvin commanders and, well, the details aren't pleasant. He took another drink before continuing. But here's the part that still gives me nightmares. When my unit finally reached the facility 2 hours later, the humans were already preparing to leave. The entire operation, what we had calculated would take at least a week of careful siege warfare, was over in 127 minutes. A Vegan trader spoke up nervously. At least it was quick. Quick, yes. But that wasn't the disturbing part. Zektar's voice grew quiet again. The disturbing part was how calm they were afterwards. No celebration, no boasting. Colonel Chen was already planning the next mission while her medics treated the wounded. He gestured broadly. Do you know what the human casualties were for that operation? 7 wounded. 7. Out of 200 Marines assaulting a fortified position against superior numbers. And do you know what they talked about during the evacuation? The crowd waited expectantly. Sports. They were arguing about something called baseball statistics, as if they hadn't just performed what every military academy in the galaxy would classify as an impossible mission. Zektar stood again, his movements agitated. But the real revelation came 3 days later, during the assault on Corvin Prime itself. The humans had studied the recordings of our attack patterns, analyzed our tactical doctrines, and identified what they called optimization opportunities. He began pacing once more. Colonel Chen requested a private meeting with our commanding officer, General Thexva. She presented him with a detailed analysis of how we could improve our combat effectiveness, not criticism, collaboration. She wanted to share human tactical innovations with us. That sounds reasonable, offered a Rigelian pilot. Reasonable, yes. Terrifying, also, yes. Zektar's compound eyes reflected the cantina's lights strangely. Because her innovations included things like using our natural climbing abilities to scale vertical surfaces that humans couldn't navigate. She had identified tactical possibilities that we ourselves had never considered. The veteran stopped pacing and faced his audience directly. In other words, this human had watched us fight for exactly 1 engagement and already understood our capabilities better than we did. She saw patterns in our behavior that our own strategists had missed. He returned to his seat slowly. General Thexva was intrigued enough to authorize a joint operation. The target was Corvin Prime's orbital defense platform, a massive structure protected by energy shields and automated weapons systems. Standard doctrine called for a prolonged bombardment followed by boarding actions. Let me guess, said Crix. The humans had a different idea? Oh, they had ideas plural, Zektar confirmed. Colonel Chen proposed what she called a multi-vector simultaneous assault. While my people provided covering fire and electronic warfare support, human units would attack the station from 17 different angles at once. He shook his head slowly. 17 different angles. On a spherical structure in 3-dimensional space. Most species think in terms of up, down, and the cardinal directions. Humans apparently think in terms of mathematical coordinates. A Manthari engineer leaned forward. How do you coordinate that many attack vectors? That's what I asked, Zektar replied. Colonel Chen showed me their battle plan. It was like nothing I had ever seen. A 3-dimensional tactical display that showed unit movements over time with contingency plans for dozens of possible scenarios. He gestured helplessly with all 4 arms. But the plan itself wasn't the frightening part. The frightening part was watching them execute it. Every human unit knew not just their own objectives, but the objectives of every other unit. They moved like pieces of a single organism, adapting to changing conditions without missing a beat. The veteran's voice grew quieter. I was assigned to observe one of their assault teams. The squad leader was a corporal named Davies, barely old enough to serve in most military organizations. But when his team's insertion point was blocked by unexpected defenses, he improvised a new approach in real time. What did he do? He used his soldiers as projectiles. Zektar's mandibles clicked rapidly. Davies identified a structural weakness in the station's hull and had his demolitions expert create a shaped charge that would breach it. Then he ordered 2 of his Marines to ride the explosion through the hole it created. The cantina fell silent, except for the ambient hum of the station's life support systems. They volunteered, Zektar continued, without hesitation. Davies explained what he needed, and 2 Marines immediately stepped forward to be launched through space in an explosion-powered trajectory that had maybe a 60% chance of success. He took a long drink before continuing. Both Marines survived the insertion and secured the breach point for the rest of the squad. What should have been a 40-minute assault took 12 minutes because humans are willing to use their own bodies as ammunition. A Zalarian trader spoke up nervously. Surely that was an extreme case. I wish it was, Zektar replied. But every human unit performed similar innovations. They used their helmets as improvised grenades, their tools as weapons, their emergency supplies as psychological warfare devices. One Marine team created a distraction by broadcasting human music through the station's communication system. Music as warfare? Apparently something called death metal is particularly effective at disrupting Corvan concentration, Zektar explained. Who thinks of using artistic expression as a tactical weapon? The veteran's expression grew distant again. The orbital platform fell in 4 hours. 4 hours for a target that our analysts had estimated would take weeks to capture. And when it was over, the humans immediately began studying Corvan defensive patterns to develop countermeasures for future engagements. He looked around at the assembled crowd. That's when I realized what we were dealing with. Humans don't just fight wars, they study war. Every engagement is a learning opportunity. Every enemy is a puzzle to be solved. Zektar's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They are a species that has turned violence into a science and warfare into an art form. And the most terrifying part? They're just getting started. The cantina remained silent as the old veteran finished his drink and prepared to continue his tale. The cantina's atmosphere had grown heavy with tension as Zektar's first tale concluded. Several patrons had quietly departed, their faces pale with newfound understanding. But those who remained seemed drawn to the old veteran like moths to a flame, desperate to hear more despite their growing unease. Zektar noticed their expressions and his mandibles spread in what might have been amusement. You think that was disturbing? That was just humans fighting a conventional war against a known enemy. You want to hear something that will really keep you awake at night? Let me tell you about the siege of Zarion 7th. A Vorthon mercenary who had served in multiple conflicts shifted uncomfortably. I've heard of Zarion 7th. That was the Hive War, wasn't it? Against the Scarnathi? Indeed, Zektar confirmed, his voice taking on a darker tone. The Scarnathi were unlike anything the galaxy had encountered before. A hive-minded insectoid species with no concept of individual identity. They couldn't be negotiated with, bribed, or intimidated. They simply consumed everything in their path. The veteran's compound eyes reflected the cantina's dim lighting as he continued. When they overran the Zarian system, the Galactic Council was paralyzed. How do you fight an enemy that feels no fear, shows no mercy, and treats death as merely a temporary inconvenience to the collective? He paused to order another drink, his movements deliberate and controlled. The Scarnathi had already devoured 7 worlds by the time the Council decided to take action. Billions of sentients dead or worse, incorporated into their biomechanical collective. The joint task force assembled to retake Zarion 7th included the finest military units from 23 species. Including humans? Asked Crix, though his earlier bravado had faded considerably. Oh yes, Zektar replied, but here's what made this different from the Corvan campaign. The humans arriving at Zarion 7 weren't the same Marines I had fought alongside before. These were different units. Specialists in what they called asymmetric warfare. He took a long drink before continuing. The human commander was Admiral Rebecca Torres, and she brought with her something I had never seen before, a complete psychological profile of human combat behavior, not tactics or strategy, but psychology. A Rigelian trader leaned forward nervously. What do you mean? I mean, Zektar explained, that Admiral Torres had spent 30 years studying not just how humans fight, but why they fight the way they do. She understood something about her own species that even they didn't fully comprehend. The veteran began his characteristic pacing, but his movements were more controlled now, almost predatory. The initial assault on Zarian 7th followed standard doctrine: orbital bombardment, ground insertion, establish beachheads. But the Scarnathi weren't like the Corvin. They didn't defend territory, they absorbed it. His voice grew quieter, more intense. Every position we captured was immediately infiltrated by Scarnathi bioorganisms. The ground itself became hostile, covered with their organic technology. Traditional warfare was not just ineffective, it was counterproductive. Every attack we made simply fed more resources to the collective. Zektar stopped pacing and faced his audience. After 2 weeks of conventional assault, we had lost 30% of our forces and gained exactly 0 permanent territory. The other species commanders were ready to recommend orbital sterilization of the entire planet. But not the humans, guessed the Vorthon mercenary. No, not the humans. Zektar's mandibles clicked rapidly. Admiral Torres called a strategic conference and presented what she called Alternative Protocol 7. She had been studying not just the Scarnathi, but the psychological stress patterns of her own forces. He gestured with one of his 4 arms. Torres had discovered something remarkable. While every other species in the task force was showing normal signs of combat fatigue and demoralization, human stress indicators were actually decreasing as the conflict intensified. A Keltorian engineer spoke up. That makes no sense. Stress should increase with battlefield intensity. That's what I thought too, Zektar agreed. But Torres explained that humans have what she called adversarial adaptation syndrome. The more impossible a situation becomes, the more creative and determined they become in response. The veteran returned to his seat, his movements now carrying an almost reverent quality. She proposed abandoning conventional military doctrine entirely and instead implementing what she called terror protocols. The cantina fell completely silent. Not terror against us, Zektar clarified quickly. Terror against the Scarnathi. Torres had realized that while the collective consciousness couldn't feel fear in the way individual minds could, it could still be disrupted by sufficiently chaotic stimuli. He leaned forward conspiratorially. The plan she proposed was simple in concept and absolutely horrifying in execution. Instead of trying to defeat the Scarnathi through military superiority, the humans would make themselves into something so unpredictable, so chaotic, that the collective intelligence couldn't process their behavior patterns. "How do you weaponize chaos?" asked a Manthari captain. Zektar's eyes grew distant. "I watched them do it." Admiral Torres divided her forces into what she called disruption cells, small groups of humans who operated with no centralized command structure, no predetermined objectives, and no communication with other units. He shook his head slowly. Each cell was given a simple mandate: cause maximum confusion through unpredictable action. They weren't trying to capture territory or eliminate specific targets. They were trying to introduce so much randomness into the battlefield that the Scarnathi collective would lose its ability to coordinate responses. The veteran's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Do you understand what that means? They deliberately abandoned military discipline and embraced complete tactical chaos as a strategy. And it worked. A young Altarian merchant raised a tentacled appendage. But how do you control chaos? How do you ensure it doesn't destroy your own forces?" "You don't control it," Zektar replied matter-of-factly. That was the point. Admiral Torres had realized that humans possess a unique psychological trait. They actually function better in chaotic environments than in structured ones. He began describing the implementation of the terror protocols with clinical precision. Human disruption cells began appearing throughout Scarnathi-controlled territory, but their actions followed no discernible pattern. One cell spent 3 days doing nothing but broadcasting human poetry through hijacked Scarnathi communication networks. Another cell used chemical explosives to carve human facial expressions into mountainsides visible from orbit. The cantina patrons exchanged uncomfortable glances. A third cell, Zektar continued, infiltrated a Scarnathi bioprocessing facility and replaced all their organic nutrients with human foodstuffs. The collective spent weeks trying to analyze why their drones were suddenly craving something called pizza. He paused for effect. But the most disturbing cell was led by a human sergeant named Mitchell. His team spent a month following Scarnathi patrols around the battlefield, never attacking, never interfering, just following them while playing human music and occasionally applauding their actions. A Rigelian trader spoke up nervously. Applauding? Apparently, Zektar explained. Humans have a concept called sarcastic appreciation. Mitchell's team would literally clap their hands together to show approval whenever the Scarnathi did something particularly destructive, as if they were watching a performance. The veteran's voice grew more animated. The Scarnathi collective intelligence began devoting enormous computational resources to analyzing these behavioral patterns. What did the applause mean? Was it a form of communication? A tactical signal? A religious ritual? He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Meanwhile, other human cells were implementing completely different forms of chaos. Some painted human artwork on Scarnathi structures. Others left human literature in strategic locations. One cell spent 2 weeks teaching captured Scarnathi drones how to play human games. Games? Several voices asked simultaneously. Something called rock, paper, scissors, Zektar replied. A simple competitive activity that requires individual decision-making. The Scarnathi drones who learned it began exhibiting signs of independent thought, which created processing conflicts within the collective consciousness. The veteran stood up again, his movements now sharp and agitated. But the real breakthrough came when a human cell led by Captain Sarah Kim discovered something extraordinary about Scarnathi psychology. The collective consciousness couldn't process human humor. He faced his audience directly. Kim's team began telling jokes to captured Scarnathi, not as torture, not as interrogation, but as genuine attempts at cross-species communication. And the collective intelligence literally couldn't comprehend the logical structures involved in humorous expression. Zektar's mandibles clicked rapidly as he recalled the events. I monitored Scarnathi communication networks during one of these sessions. The collective was attempting to analyze a human joke that went, "Why did the quantum physicist cross the road?" Because they were already on both sides, simultaneously. The cantina remained silent as the implications sank in. The collective spent 17 hours and significant computational resources trying to understand the logical framework of that joke, Zektar continued. 17 hours during which their military coordination suffered measurable degradation. He began pacing again, his steps quick and nervous. Admiral Torres recognized the opportunity immediately. She issued what she called Comedy Protocol Alpha to all human units. Their new primary mission was to confuse the Scarnathi collective through systematic application of human humor. A Vorthan mercenary spoke up. "You're telling us they won a war through comedy?" "Not just comedy," Zektar clarified. "They weaponized every aspect of human culture that the Scarnathi couldn't understand. Music, art, literature, sports, religious practices, philosophical debates, romantic poetry, anything that required individual consciousness to comprehend." The veteran's voice grew more intense. Human units began broadcasting what they called cultural warfare throughout Scarnathi territory, 24-hour transmissions of human stand-up comedy, opera performances, political debates, cooking shows, and something called reality television. He paused for a long drink before continuing. The effect on the Scarnathi collective was devastating. Their processing efficiency dropped by 40% as they attempted to analyze human cultural expressions that had no logical framework they could comprehend. Zektar returned to his seat, his movements now carrying a sense of awe. But the most brilliant tactical innovation came from a human lance corporal named Jessica Wong. She realized that the Scarnathi Collective was attempting to understand human behavior by analyzing patterns, so she proposed introducing completely random elements that would overload their analytical capabilities. "What kind of random elements?" asked a Keltorian engineer. Wong's unit began performing what they called interpretive dance in the middle of combat operations, Zektar explained, his voice filled with incredulous respect. Spontaneous artistic expression with no tactical purpose whatsoever. The cantina patron stared at him in disbelief. I watched security footage of Wong's team engaging Scarnathi forces while simultaneously performing what humans call ballet, the veteran continued. They were fighting a life-or-death battle while gracefully leaping and spinning through the air for no reason other than to confuse the enemy. He shook his head slowly. The Scarnathi Collective diverted massive computational resources to analyzing these dance patterns, searching for tactical significance that simply didn't exist. Meanwhile, human forces were advancing through their territory unopposed. Zektar's expression grew distant again. The final breakthrough came when Admiral Torres realized that the collective intelligence was becoming increasingly unstable as it tried to process human irrationality. She authorized what she called Ultimate Chaos Protocol. The veteran's voice dropped to a whisper. Every human unit on Zerion 7 simultaneously began behaving in completely unpredictable ways. Some units held tea parties in the middle of battlefields. Others organized impromptu sporting events. One unit spent an entire day building snowmen out of local materials. He looked around at his audience with something approaching reverence. The Scarnathi collective consciousness, faced with hundreds of thousands of individual humans all acting in completely irrational yet purposeful ways, simply broke. Their unified intelligence fragmented into millions of confused individual minds, each trying to understand human behavior on its own. The cantina remained silent for long moments as the implications sank in. Within 72 hours, Zektar concluded, the entire Scarnathi presence on Zerion 7 had collapsed. Not defeated, confused into dysfunction. The humans had literally thought them to death using weaponized creativity and systematic unpredictability. He finished his drink and signaled for another. That's when I truly understood what we were dealing with. Humans aren't just warriors or tacticians or strategists. They are a species that can weaponize the very concept of consciousness itself. The veteran's compound eyes reflected the cantina's lighting strangely as he prepared to continue his tale. But if you think that was disturbing, wait until you hear about what happened during the Void War. The atmosphere in the cantina had become almost suffocating as Zektar's second tale concluded. More patrons had quietly slipped away, their faces pale and troubled. Those who remained seemed paralyzed between fascination and horror, unable to leave yet dreading what they might hear next. Zektar observed their reactions with something that might have been sympathy on his alien features. "You look disturbed, my friends. Perhaps you're beginning to understand why I drink alone most nights." A Manthari captain who had remained throughout both previous stories spoke up, his voice strained. "The Void War, that was against the entropy cult, wasn't it? The ones who worshipped universal dissolution?" "Indeed," Zektar confirmed, his voice now carrying a weight that seemed to make the very air heavier. "The entropy cult wasn't just another hostile species or collective intelligence. They were something far worse. Beings who had transcended physical existence and sought to unmake reality itself." The veteran's forearms moved restlessly as he continued. By the time the Galactic Council recognized the threat, 17 star systems had simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, not conquered, erased from the fabric of space-time as if they had never been. He paused to order another drink, his movements mechanical and precise. The cult existed partially outside our dimensional framework. They could manipulate fundamental forces, alter physical constants, and unravel the quantum foundations of matter itself. How do you fight an enemy that can simply decide that your weapons don't exist anymore? A young Zalarian trader who had somehow found the courage to remain spoke up nervously. But surely the combined fleets of the galaxy lasted exactly 47 minutes against a single cult manifestation, Zektar interrupted. I know because I was there. Watched 12,000 warships from 53 different species simply fade out of existence like they were never built. The cantina fell silent, except for the veterans' measured breathing. That's when humanity's high command proposed something that should have been impossible, he continued. Admiral Elena Vasquez requested permission to implement what she called ontological warfare protocols. Zektar's compound eyes focused on something far beyond the cantina walls. None of us understood what that meant at the time. How could we? We were thinking in terms of conventional physics, while the humans had apparently been preparing for a war against the fundamental nature of reality itself. He took a long drink before continuing. Admiral Vasquez's briefing was unsettling. She explained that human philosophers and scientists had spent centuries contemplating the nature of existence, consciousness, and reality. They had developed theoretical frameworks for surviving what they called existential warfare. A Rigelian merchant leaned forward despite his obvious fear. What does that even mean? It means, Zektar replied slowly, that humans had already considered the possibility that they might someday need to fight enemies who could rewrite the laws of physics, and they had prepared for it. The veteran began his familiar pacing, but his movements now carried an almost religious reverence. The human approach to the entropy cult was based on a concept they called aggressive reality assertion. Instead of accepting that their enemies could manipulate fundamental forces, they chose to insist on their own version of how the universe should work. He stopped and faced his audience directly. I know how insane that sounds, but I watched them do it. Human forces began operating under what Vasquez called narrative coherence protocols. They simply refused to acknowledge that impossible things were happening to them. How do you refuse to acknowledge reality? Asked a Vorthon mercenary. Zektar's mandibles clicked rapidly as he recalled the events. I was assigned to observe a human unit called the Paradox Marines during their first engagement with the cult. When reality warping effects began manifesting around them, the Marines didn't react with confusion or fear. They acted like everything was proceeding according to normal combat procedures. He gestured helplessly with all four arms. A cult manifestation altered local gravity to pull them toward a dimensional rift. The Marines simply activated magnetic boots and continued their mission, as if walking on walls was a routine training exercise. When their weapons were temporarily erased from existence, they improvised melee weapons from debris and kept fighting. The veteran's voice grew more animated. But the truly disturbing part was their communication during these impossible events. I monitored their tactical frequencies throughout the engagement. Do you know what they talked about while reality was literally dissolving around them? The crowd waited expectantly. Equipment maintenance schedules, Zektar replied matter-of-factly. Sergeant Maria Santos was explaining proper rifle cleaning procedures to a new recruit while a cult entity was attempting to erase her from the timeline. She just ignored it and kept talking about bore brushes and cleaning solvents. He began pacing again, his steps more agitated. Another Marine, Corporal David Kim, was discussing meal preparation techniques while walking through a region where the laws of thermodynamics had been temporarily suspended. He treated the impossible like it was a minor inconvenience. A Keltorian engineer spoke up nervously. But surely that's just psychological conditioning, training to remain calm under stress? That's what I thought initially, Zektar agreed. But then I witnessed something that changed my understanding of human consciousness forever. A cult manifestation attempted to erase Sergeant Santos from existence, not kill her, but remove her from the timeline so that she had never existed. The cantina grew so quiet that the ambient hum of life support systems seemed deafening. The erasure effect began at her feet and moved upward. Zektar continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I could see her molecular structure beginning to dissolve. Any rational being would have panicked, or at least acknowledged what was happening. He stopped pacing and stared directly at his audience. Instead, Sergeant Santos looked down at her disappearing legs and said, "That's inconvenient." Then she continued explaining rifle maintenance while hopping on one foot, because the other had temporarily ceased to exist. The veteran's voice carried an edge of awe and terror. The most disturbing part was that her refusal to acknowledge the impossibility of her situation somehow stabilized the erasure effect. By treating her partial non-existence as merely annoying rather than logically impossible, she prevented the effect from completing. A young Altarian merchant raised a trembling appendage. How is that even possible? Admiral Vasquez explained it during the post-mission briefing, Zektar replied. According to human theoretical physics, consciousness plays a role in determining the structure of reality. The entropy cult's power came from their ability to convince the universe that certain things were impossible. He returned to his seat, his movements now carrying a sense of exhausted wonder. But humans, apparently, possess what Vasquez called ontological stubbornness. They can simply refuse to accept that impossible things are happening, and their refusal somehow makes those things less impossible. The veteran took a long drink before continuing. The implications of this discovery led to the development of what became known as reality marine units, specially trained human soldiers who were conditioned to treat absolutely anything as merely another tactical challenge. How do you train someone for that? Asked a Manthari captain. Zektar's mandibles spread in what might have been a smile. I observed their training programs. Human recruits were subjected to progressively more impossible scenarios and taught to respond with bureaucratic annoyance rather than existential terror. He gestured broadly. They practiced filling out paperwork while falling through dimensional rifts. They conducted equipment inspections while existing in multiple timelines simultaneously. They held staff meetings while their commanding officers were temporarily transformed into abstract mathematical concepts. The cantina patrons stared at him in stunned silence. The training culminated in something called the Impossible Scenario Final Exam, Zektar continued. Recruits had to complete routine military tasks while everything around them violated fundamental laws of physics. Those who passed did so by treating cosmic horror as a minor workplace inconvenience. The veteran's expression grew distant as he recalled specific events. I watched a reality marine named Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh conduct the equipment inventory while the base she was standing on existed in 17 different dimensions simultaneously. She just made 17 separate lists and filed them in triplicate. He shook his head slowly. Another Marine, Captain Robert Chen, held a normal strategy meeting with his staff while half of them were temporarily existing as sentient music. He treated their melodic responses as verbal communication and continued the briefing as scheduled. Zektar's voice dropped to barely audible levels. But the true test of human ontological warfare came during the final assault on the entropy cult's home dimension. Admiral Vasquez personally led a fleet of reality marines into a region of space where the concept of existence itself was under attack. The veteran stood up again, his movements now sharp and purposeful. I accompanied the assault force as an observer, though I now question the wisdom of that decision. What I witnessed in that place, it changed my understanding of what consciousness can accomplish when properly directed. He faced his audience directly. The entropy cult's home dimension existed in a state of controlled dissolution. Physical laws were suggestions rather than rules. Causality flowed backward. Effect preceded cause. Dead beings were more real than living ones. How do you fight in a place like that? whispered a Rigelian traitor. You don't fight, Zektar replied. You impose. Admiral Vasquez's fleet entered that nightmare realm and simply insisted that normal physics applied to them, not through technology or psychic power, but through sheer psychological determination. The veteran began pacing again, his steps measured and deliberate. I watched human Marines walk through regions where gravity flowed upward by acting as if they expected it to flow downward. Their expectations somehow made it so. They fired weapons that shouldn't have been able to function by assuming they would work properly. His voice grew more intense. But the most remarkable demonstration of human ontological warfare occurred when Lieutenant Walsh encountered the entropy cult's primary manifestation, a being of pure dissolution that existed by unmaking everything around it. Zektar stopped pacing and faced his audience. This entity had erased entire star systems by convincing the universe they had never existed. It was the personification of cosmic entropy, the living embodiment of universal heat death. He paused for effect. Lieutenant Walsh looked at this manifestation of existential horror, consulted her tactical manual, and arrested it for disturbing the peace. The cantina fell completely silent. She read it its rights, Zektar continued in an awed whisper. The fundamental force of universal dissolution, and she informed it that it had the right to remain silent and that anything it said could be used against it in a court of law. The veteran's compound eyes reflected the cantina's lighting strangely. The entity was so confused by this response that it actually began to exist more solidly, trying to understand the logical framework of human law enforcement procedures. Walsh handcuffed it with standard restraining devices that shouldn't have been able to contain a cosmic force. He returned to his seat slowly. That's when I realized what humans truly are. They're not just another species that happens to be good at warfare. They are beings capable of imposing their will on the fundamental structure of reality itself, through nothing more than stubborn refusal to acknowledge that something can't be done. Zektar finished his drink and signaled for another. The entropy cult was defeated not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but because humans simply refused to accept that universal dissolution was a valid outcome. They filed paperwork declaring it a municipal violation and processed it through their legal system. The veteran's voice carried a mix of admiration and terror. Do you understand what that means? Humans possess the ability to bureaucratically defeat cosmic horror. They can fill out forms that make impossible things comply with municipal regulations. He looked around at his remaining audience with something approaching pity. That's why I drink alone most nights, friends, because I've seen what humans can do when they decide that reality needs to be corrected, and the most terrifying part is that they're still learning. Zektar's mandibles clicked one final time as he prepared to conclude his tale. The war ended when Admiral Vasquez submitted an official complaint to the universe itself, citing the entropy cult for excessive existential violations and requesting that they be evicted from reality for disturbing the cosmic peace. The cantina remained in stunned silence as the old veteran finished his final drink. The complaint was approved, he whispered. Somewhere in the depths of human bureaucracy, there's a filing cabinet that contains the official paperwork for evicting cosmic horror from existence. And that, my friends, is why I never want to see humans truly angry. The veteran stood slowly, gathered his belongings, and headed toward the cantina's exit. As he reached the door, he turned back one final time. Sleep well tonight if you can. And remember, somewhere out there, humans are probably filing reports about their daily activities. Routine paperwork that just happens to keep the universe functioning properly. With that, Zektar disappeared into the station's corridors, leaving behind a cantina full of beings who would never look at humans the same way again.